So this time I'm going to do something a little more freeform. I didn't write a script for this one. I just thought it would be fun to show what I mean when I say learn by viewing, because I use that phrase a couple times in the tutorial, and I want to show that you can really use the TDesc browser to just learn how things work, find cool stuff about the game, find out how traits and buffs might be doing things that you never expected them to be doing, and how easy it is to change those things and add new stuff to them. So I didn't have anything in mind. I'm literally just going to wing it. Let's find some sort of trait and see if we can find some cool stuff it does. Let's see. Let's go with snob. Trait snob. So traits usually, not everything they do is handled in this trait file. A lot of them have a core buff that they apply that's always active on the sim, and then interactions on things will look for that buff, and that's what lets the sim do those things. Sometimes the trait gives them the interaction. It's all over the place. I don't know why it's not consistent, but it's not consistent. So let's see. This one's got a lot more stuff in it than a lot of the other traits I've looked at do, but like you can learn just by reading this. You can almost read this like a book. If you read this left to right, pay attention to everything you're looking at, you can get a lot of information from it. The way it's sorted in here, usually you can skim through the green stuff, and that's like the important stuff, and then there's always comments on everything. The comments come directly from I don't believe they come from the developers. It's just kind of automatically read from the information. Like the TDesks know that this number means this information, and this just displays it for you. But these details here, those do come from the devs. This information's not written by Lot51 or anybody else. It just shows up because the TDesc, I actually don't know what a TDesc is, but I should probably know what that is, shouldn't I? But whatever it is, it's got this information in it, and that's why this tool is so useful. So let's try reading it top to bottom and see what it tells us. So the snob trait is for these ages: teen, adult, elder, young adult. So kids can't be snobs. Buff replacements. Buff environment, BB gameplay effects, that's build by gameplay effects. Good environment, small. So when the sim gets the good environment buff, instead they get this replacement, buff hidden mood replacement. Well, that's not very informative, so let me click on that, open it in a new tab, and see if we can find out what this is. Buff hidden move replacement. It's got a test if it's human. Well, that's obvious. Loot on removal, blah blah blah. Takes the place of moodlets when traits dictate the moodlet should be blocked. Okay, so that seems to mean that when a snob is in an environment that's good but not super good, they don't actually get a buff. So snobs, if they're in a nice environment that's not amazing, they're not going to get the normal, wow, this is a nice looking environment buff, which I didn't know that. So already something new has shown up. It also replaces the medium good environment buff with buff environment gameplay effects snob medium. See, this one sounds like it's different, so let's see what this one does. Open a new tab. You can middle click on these tabs to close them too, just like in a browser. So this one, what does this one say? Oh, it's just a different happy buff. Beautifully decorated. Having decorations around makes for happy environs. Oh, nope, I'm stupid. I opened the wrong one. I opened the default one. So that's the one that gets replaced. Let's open the one that it replaces it with. That one. 238491. It's this one. I opened the wrong one. I think I opened the one from the next section for the next replacement. Yeah, good environment large would be the next one. So the medium one gets replaced with this one. And this one says, decently decorated. The aesthetics of this house are acceptable. So when a snob is in a medium good environment, instead of getting the normal medium good buff, which we can actually go properly look at and see what that one says. So instead of getting this buff, which says nicely decorated, having decorations around makes for happy environs, they get this buff, decently decorated. So built right into the snob trait are these buff replacements for all these different things. Facial mask applied gold, buff type facial mask applied gold special. So they get a different one if they have a gold face mask on. Let's see what that one does. Imagine using a plain old sheet mask when you could have gold. Sim first name's worries are melting away with style. Buff name relaxing. So now that we've looked at those, you just learned how to make a buff replacement. Even if I didn't give you any information on how to do it, it's right here. If you go into a trait, you can find this section that says buff replacements, and you can add your own. And if it doesn't have any, you can add new ones, start it off, or you can edit what's there. And you learn that just by looking at this file and figuring out how it works. So now if we wanted to add a new buff replacement, we know how. We can say when this sim has the bear nearby buff, if they're out camping and there's a bear nearby, instead we can replace it with literally any other buff. This is just an example, so it doesn't really matter. I'm going to click on this one. And what that means is, now if we were to save this and put it into a package and have a snob sim near a bear, instead of getting the buff for being near a bear, they would get this one. And it's that easy. You can do that with anything you want. You could totally overhaul a trait if you wanted to do this. If you think one of these traits doesn't really make your sim feel like they're any different, you could add 25 buff replacements for a bunch of common buffs that sims get, and it would start to seem like they were living a different life than somebody who didn't have that buff. So let me try something else. Let's find something else and see if anything interesting shows up. Let's look at a loot. Loots are it's basically a reward. Whenever your sim gets something, it's a loot. If you do an interaction and it has a result, that result is usually a loot. So let's say loot for had woohoo. So we can assume that this shows up when your sim has woohoo. And just like before, you can read it top to bottom. Loot actions, trait add, trait, hidden, had woohoo. So now we know that when your sim has woohoo, they get a trait added to them that permanently marks them as having done this before. It's basically the lost your virginity trait. So now you know that's hidden on sims. Buff type, woohoo with ghost, test set actor is not ghost, test set target is ghost. So what does that mean? That means your sim has woohoo, they will get a buff for woohooing with a ghost if the actor is not a ghost, the sim performing the action is the actor, and the target is a ghost. That's pretty easy to understand. Actions, loot, werewolf, woohoo. Not sure what that's talking about, so let's click on that and find out what that means. Open that one in a new tab. Loots can have other loots inside of them. That's what this actions is. If we go here, actions, it says apply a set of loot operations. So that means when the sim gets this loot, they also get this one, but it has to follow the rules inside of this one. So this is its own loot, separate, that says you get a buff. The buff reason is from, and the buff is buff werewolf woohoo. The test is for a trait. There must be one of the listed traits for it to work on the target sim, so the other sim that you're having woohoo with, and that whitelisted trait that is required is that the other sim is a werewolf that has manifested. This looks like total gibberish if you're not used to modding, but that was really easy to read, wasn't it? So now we know that when your sim has woohoo, it'll run through all these things. It will definitely give your sim this trait because there's no tests. If the other sim happens to be a ghost, you'll get this buff, and if the other sim is a werewolf, you'll get this buff. Now, the reason this is a separate one instead of just written in here like this is probably because they made this loot separate for the werewolves pack, and then when the werewolves pack came out, they updated this loot to just reference that loot instead. But now, just by viewing this package, you've learned how to add traits to your sims via rewards. You literally do trait add and select the trait. You learned how to add buffs to sims via the results of interactions by making a loot action that adds a buff. You learned how to test for certain things, and you learned that you can put other loots that already exist inside of your new loots. So if you want to make a brand new loot and you also want it to do something that you know the game can already do, you can just go into here, into the loot actions, add a new node, choose actions, and you can find any existing loot in the game. So we can say loot buff drink flirty. Now when your sim has woohoo, they'll also get whatever's in there. You can add another one, go in here, you can say it doesn't matter. I don't know why I'm trying to find something that makes sense. It's not like the drink one made sense. Door padlock loot unlocks goats. I have no idea what that is, but now when your sim has woohoo, they'll get it. And let's see. Well, it looks like it will unlock a door for a goat. Well, that won't do anything because that doesn't have anything to do with anything. But that's an example of how you can modify the rewards for things. So I made a mod that changes how, what was it? It's the, what's the tall grass from Horse Ranch? The wild grass. I changed what you get from that. So let's search grass and loot and see if we can find it. Loot wild grass harvest. That's probably the right one. So this is it. So what this is, when you harvest wild grass, it does these loot actions. The loot action is create object. Okay, that makes sense. The definition, which is, the definition is usually for objects. Like this is the definition, this is the ID of the object that you'll get. So the object you get is wild grass hay, expansion pack 14, set 1, prairie grass hay. So one of the things you can get is prairie grass hay. It goes into your inventory. The person who gets it is the actor, so that's the sim doing the interaction, and you get 2. And then this follows the same format. It's a different hay. You get 1. The test is for if the grass value is overgrown. So that's testing the object to see if the object is overgrown, because that's a state on the grass. And if it is, you'll get one of these. You get a buff from harvesting prairie grass. Cuts, base chance 30. So there's a 30% chance when you harvest prairie grass that you get a cut. If you're a rancher, let's see, what does this say? Create object, base chance 20. So there's a 20% chance that you will get another piece of hay, I guess. One of them. If you are a rancher. So if you're a rancher, you'll get an extra piece of hay. Had to do a little cut there, don't mind me. But before, you remember on the other one, the trait test, whitelist required 1, whitelist traits rancher. You remember that from before? Well, now you know, based on looking at a couple of files, that when you have something happening in the game, you can test for a specific trait, and the way to do that is to make it whitelisted, and you have to tell the game that that trait has to be there. Now, in the first video, I brought one of these up, whitelists, and I screwed it up. I had done something wrong. But let me show you real quick. If I say number whitelisted 2, we can assume that you have to have 2 traits listed under this whitelist. Let's do train trait fear of failure. The sim is required to have the specified number of traits from this list in order to pass the test. So now, this extra bonus will only apply if a sim is a rancher with a fear of failure. But we can just intuit that if we have 3 traits listed here, this test will pass as long as any 2 of them are active. It doesn't have to be all 3. It won't happen with just 1, but it will happen with any 2. And we didn't learn that anywhere. Like, we didn't read something that says, hey, this is how it works. And I didn't tell you, well, I did tell you in the first video, but I didn't tell you, hey, this is how it works. You can just intuit it from reading the information that's already here, reading these little tooltips, and just using educated guesses. And of course, you can always just make changes like crazy and go in game and test. So I could even go up here to quantity, change this to 52. Don't know why it typed a 0. 52. And now, when your sim does this, they have a 20% chance of getting 52 pieces of wild grass, but only if they are a rancher with a fear of failure, or they're wearing a crystal helmet with a ruby and have fear of failure, or if they're a rancher wearing a crystal helmet with a ruby. Because we made it require 2 of these traits, and we listed 3 traits. It sounds complicated. It's not that complicated. Change this number, 65. Now it's a 65% chance. Go to the definition. Change the definition to some other thing that I don't have a number for, but let's pretend this is a number. Dog treats. So now, if I had put in the right number, that would mean 65% chance of dog treats if all this other stuff is true. It's not as hard as it sounds. And for one more quick example before I realized that I probably should have done a tutorial on how to make this kind of stuff, buffs and loots, before I made a tutorial about reading through the files. I'm just going to show you how much you can learn from just reading these nodes here. I mean, like I said, I learned how to do most of this stuff just from browsing the files, so it's not a bad idea to just go in and browse the files. Just like pick something you know from the game or think you know how it works and just kind of look through it and see what happens. But, so let's see. This is a buff. We add this buff to the sim and walk style. If enabled, specify a walk style override to apply to the sim. E.g., sims with the bummed buff walk in a sad fashion. So that's pretty cut and dry. If we enable this, that means that if our sim has this buff, they have a different walk style. Now I don't know the resource keys for the walk style, so I can't fill that out, but I can find them and fill that out, and my buff could now replace the walk style. Or we know from playing the game that the moody teen buff has a special walk style. So let's do moody and buff. Nope, that's not what it's called. Let's see. Teen and buff. Ah, there we go. Teen mood swing. Sad. It's probably that one. Let's click on it. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Walk style enabled. Pop these open. There it is. Now we know we can copy this, go back to this one, pop it in here. This one said priority buff, or priority emotion. So let's match that, because that's how the one in the game works. And now, this new buff will give a sim the teen mood swing sad walk style when they have this buff. Nobody told us that. We just learned it by peeking at the files. Let's see. Loot on addition. Loot that will be applied when the buff is added to the sim. So when a sim gets this buff, we just learned what loots are, remember? And here's that buff that we looked at in the woohoo example. Loot buff drink flirty. You click on that. That's all you need. This is now a fully functional buff. And if your sim gets it, they will get the flirty buff drink for whatever reason, and they'll start walking like they're sad. Loot on removal. Loot that will be applied when buff is removed from sim. Let's try and just add something random in there. Now we know that when this buff goes away from the sim, they will get whatever this loot does. Now let's say this is a big one, game effect modifiers. Let's pop open game effect modifiers and see what's in here. It's one of these drop downs. Affordance filters. Affordances are interactions. Filters, modifiers, autonomy modifier. That's a big one. statistic modifier, skill modifier, mood modifier, pie menu, relationship track, satisfaction point gain. Let's click on autonomy modifier. An encapsulation of a modification to sim behavior. These objects are passed to the autonomy system to affect things like scoring, which super interactions are available, etc. Ooh, lots of stuff in here. Don't know what any of that stuff is, right? Well, let's click on a random one. Decay modifiers. Statistic to float mapping for decay modifiers for statistics. All decay modifiers are multiplied together along with the decay rate. So a statistic could be a motive, it could be how far along you are with something. You can click on this and find all sorts of them and learn what those are. So motive, horse energy, childhood phase. Let's go with something easy. We know what motives are, because motives are basic stuff. So let's go to motive. Let's go to bladder, value. Multiply statistic decay by this value, 10. So now, when our sim has this buff, they'll also have their bladder drop 10 times as fast. Relationship multipliers. Pop it open, see what's in there. Here's all the different types of relationships. You can probably figure out pretty easily what these are. Go to romance. Well, this guy pees his pants pretty much constantly, so let's set his romance multiplier to 0.2. He's going to have a harder time getting romance. Apply direction. Direction which the multiplier should work on the statistic. Well, we only want this, we want his relationship to go up slower. So now his romantic relationships will increase at a rate of 0.2. If we pop this open, we can add another one. We can go to romance. This time we can make it decrease at a rate of 7. Now, if you have this buff, your romance relationships will decay 7 times faster. I mean, I'm just kind of doing random crap here right now, but I think I've made my point. I didn't teach you how any of this works. I literally just hovered over the stuff, read what it does, typed in some numbers, and now I made a fully functional, completely stupid buff. And if I get around to making an actual tutorial on how buffs and loots and traits and stuff work, you could make this buff as part of a trait. You could make this buff as part of a reward for an interaction. We did just learn how to do that, remember? We could go back into this wild grass one. We could go to the random loot actions. We could add a new one. We can go to action, and we can click on buff. We can go here, pop open buff, go back to our new buff, give it a name, Waffle stupid buff. Now remember, this doesn't work on Firefox. I do have Firefox open, but this number would have changed in any other browser. Don't do this in Firefox. You copy that number, you stick it in here, and as long as this file is in your mod file with this file, now one of the random actions for this interaction is to get that buff. And I'm rambling at this point, but I didn't tell you how to do that necessarily. It's something that you could totally have learned just from digging around in the game files. I think digging around in the game files is really fun. I do it a lot sometimes just to play around and see what stuff does. Like the new pack got a nosy trait. What does it do? The game tells you what it does, but it doesn't give you a really good description. It just says, Sims who thrive on gossip, snooping, and spying. They have incredibly poor boundaries and don't quite understand what personal space is, but they will discover secrets by any means necessary. But what does that mean? Well, I just popped it open, and it says Sims have the nosy buff. Now, when they have this trait, they have the nosy buff at all times. So we can pop that open, see what that does. But it also says they get the neighborhood traits pry interaction. Target super affordances are, I don't know, let's hover over it. Super affordances this adds to the target. Well, now that means that when they click on another sim, they get this interaction. That's why Sims with this trait have that interaction. They also get this interaction. Social neighbor traits give unwarranted advice. They can do that. And they can spy. And the buff that they get that's permanently on them, let's see. I'm not going to explain commodities right now. Skill tags modifier, photography base game, value 1.5. Skill tag modifier is skills with these tags have their amount gained multiplied by the sum of all the tuned values. So now we know the nosy trait gives the nosy buff, which gives this skill tag modifier, which is for photography, and sets it to 1.5. Nosy Sims gain photography at 1.5 times speed. Stat use multiplier. Career performance detective. Apply direction increase multiplier 2. Now we know that nosy Sims get this buff that makes their performance in the detective career twice as fast. And now we also know that if we want something similar like that in our mod, we can give our Sims a buff with a stat use multiplier. We can change the key. We can find careers. Oop, I spelled it wrong. We can pick the writer career. We can pick the secret agent career. We can pick the education career. Now we know how to make a buff that makes the education career increase at twice the speed. Which, this is an example of just learning cool information browsing the files, because the game doesn't tell you that nosy Sims are better at being secret agents. It doesn't tell you they're better criminals. It doesn't tell you they're better writers. But we can pop in here and just look and find that cool information that the game's not going to even bother to tell us. A lot of the stuff in The Sims 4 doesn't seem like it does a lot on the surface, and the descriptions don't tell you they do a lot, and even the devs doing their live streams won't tell you a lot of this information. And you're not even necessarily supposed to know it. It's just going to happen in the background. I think a lot of people prefer to know that kind of stuff. I've thought about making overhauls where I make every single trait describe itself in detail and say exactly what it does. But they don't give you this information. And I think going in and searching for it is not just fun, but it's also really educational on how this stuff works, how much work goes into making it, and how to do it yourself. Like I said, I'm just rambling at this point. This video doesn't make a lot of sense to put out without an actual buff or trait or statistic or anything like that tutorial on what those things are and how they work. But I do think it's a really good starting point for modding to just pick a thing from the game that you like, or even a thing from the game that you don't like, and try to find the files relating to it and see how they work. Pick a trait, pop it open, find the buffs that it gives you, see what they do, change them, save them, put them in your game. Remember to download the sim data when it says you have to download the sim data. If you don't do this, it won't work, and the game will not work, and it will scream at you. And just learn. Just learn by viewing. I think it's really fun. I don't know how to end this video. I don't know if that's obvious. I'm really bad at this. I like explaining things, and I could literally go for another like 4 hours if I wasn't gonna force myself to stop right here. But open the TDesc Builder, search for stuff, look through it, and learn some stuff. It's not that hard. It's really intimidating, but I promise you that you can make really cool, really impactful mods just by changing these kinds of values in existing game tuning. If you don't change any of this information and you save these files, you're making an override that completely changes how these things work with no extra steps. All you have to do is change the information, download your override, put it into a package, and you're good to go. So go in there, play with some stuff, make a thing. Oh my god, I'm rambling so bad. I'm just going to turn the video off right now. I'm not even going to end it. Bye.